I think we'll get started now as more people do log on. Apologies. So we're very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Archana, and I work with the Data Collection Unit, and this is the Data Collection webinar series that is organized by the Data and Analytics section here at UNICEF headquarters. This is the fourth and final webinar of this set, but we do plan to resume again in a few months. So for our finale, today's webinar is entitled Engendering High-Frequency Phone Surveys, a COVID-19 Response and Beyond. We are thrilled to have with us today two colleagues from the World Bank, Heather Moylan, who is a survey specialist with the World Bank Gender Group and the Living Standards Measurement Study team in the Development Data Group. We also have Daniel Halim, who is an economist with the World Bank Gender Group. Just a little bit about these two people. Heather's current research interests are in the areas of gender, poverty, and agriculture, as well as data collection methods and measurement issues. She works on the design, implementation, data quality control, and analysis of household surveys. Daniel leads impact evaluation work with the East Asia and Pacific Gender Innovation Lab, testing innovative interventions to close gender gaps. He has published research on the topics of childcare and maternal employment and intergenerational benefits of schools. His current research interests lie in the intersection of development, labor, education, and gender economics. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. So as we mentioned, today's webinar is on engendering high-frequency phone surveys. Just a little bit about that. I'm sure you've all read the abstract, but just to summarize, in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, the majority of information on the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 has largely come from remote surveys, as we all know. However, phone survey formats, as well as online surveys, pose challenges in measuring the gendered impacts of COVID-19. This presentation will outline the options to teams designing not only COVID-19 monitoring remote household surveys, but also looking forward to the post-COVID-19 world and likely increasing reliance on phone surveys. So before we begin, just to keep just a little bit of housekeeping points, we have scheduled about an hour today, starting with the presentation, followed by the Q&A. Always throughout the webinar, please remain muted and kindly write your questions in the chat box. And then we'll group those and direct them to the presenters. So the webinar is being recorded and will be available internally on our SharePoint, but also externally on the Mix YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'll hand it over to Attila to say a few words. Attila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Archana, and I don't want to take more time, of course, but I'd just like to thank Heather and Daniel for joining us today, presenting at this last webinar of the year, actually. So we plan to come back next year sometime, probably towards the end of the first quarter. But this year we wrap up with this very important topic. We have had phone survey related webinars before, at least 3 of them, I think. And this is going to be a very interesting one, specifically focusing on gender and high frequency phone surveys. So we're looking forward to it. I will come back at the end for the Q&A part of the webinar. So the floor is yours, Heather and Daniel. Thank you very much once again for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And okay, is that okay? Do you see the correct view of the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, many thanks again for the introduction and of course for inviting us to participate in this series and speak about such an important topic. We're excited to share some of the guidance that we've compiled on engendering COVID response surveys, but we also look forward to the discussion and hearing more from your team of experts on how we can all better move this agenda forward. So today we'll first go through the motivation and why it's important to engender phone surveys, and then we'll talk through some of the important considerations for doing so, such as phone survey sampling and respondent selection, questionnaire design adaptations, interview setting considerations, and then of course we'll conclude with some lessons learned from the last couple years of implementing phone surveys, but also look to the future of phone surveys and look at the critical need for them to collect better data on women and girls. So as we all know, the COVID pandemic has taken a drastic human toll. And the economic and social impacts of the pandemic are still reverberating globally. So global extreme poverty was estimated to have risen for the first time in over 20 years, and lower and middle income countries still continue to face challenges since they do face slower vaccine rollout and weaker health systems overall. So tracking the impact of COVID-19 on people can really enable governments and policymakers to understand the circumstances faced by their countries. And fortunately, the research looking at the impacts of COVID is rapidly emerging, but there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to COVID and women. So unfortunately, when it comes to women and girls, the risk is even greater. So the pandemic exacerbated risk for women and threatened gains on gender equality that we've seen over the last years. In most countries, women are on the front lines of the health workforce. Women have also lost their jobs at a faster rate than men and are more likely to be employed informally in lower and middle income countries. And so they're lacking the same access to social protection and other safety nets. Women also have faced increased childcare responsibilities since schools have closed and children are home from school. And then they're also, responsible for caring for family members that have been sick or affected by COVID. Additionally, we've seen reports of increased gender-based violence around the world. So we really want to emphasize. So we really want to emphasize that more can be done to strengthen collection of gender data and sex disaggregated data to adapt policies and provide services to those that need it most. So the World Bank and the UNSD, they conducted a global online survey to assess the impact of COVID on statistical offices, and this really gives us some insights into the behavior of NSOs and which types of surveys are still being fielded. So they sent out their first online questionnaire to NSOs in May 2020, and the results confirmed that social distancing, lockdowns, and travel restrictions disrupted the face-to-face standard survey operations. 81% of NSOs in low and lower middle income countries reported that surveys have been delayed or negatively affected. And over on the right, you can see that even by October 2020, across most regions, the majority of statistics offices were still fully or partially closed. And by the time of the last questionnaire that they fielded in May 2021, 1/3 of NSOs still remained closed to either all staff or non-essential staff. So with these disruptions in face-to-face surveys, NSOs moved to non-traditional methods of collecting data. So even by May 2020, almost 60% of countries were relying on phone surveys to collect data. And there, are definite advantages to phone surveys. So they're less expensive. You don't have to worry about the travel costs of sending field teams to households to hold the interviews, and it also saves on the logistical costs related with field work. And it is also more adaptable to changing needs. But of course, NSOs and survey practitioners really need the infrastructure to be able to maintain these types of phone survey efforts. Looking to the future, we have seen, based on the last couple of years, that phone surveys really can be leveraged in cases like the COVID-19 pandemic when face-to-face surveys cannot be fielded, or also considering the situation where now we can use, now that this infrastructure has been built to a certain extent over the last couple of years, phone surveys really can be used to complement the face-to-face surveys. So even before COVID, there was starting to be an uptick in the use of phone surveys. So a few examples are the World Bank Listening to Africa project, also phone surveys responding to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, and then also phone surveys on the food insecurity crisis across the different countries listed here. And so the guidance and efforts that had been put into these existing phone surveys really allowed different institutions to very rapidly respond to the COVID crisis and get response surveys fielded as quickly as possible. So I am going to make a special note of the World Bank high frequency phone surveys here. A lot of our presentation does rely on these surveys and analysis, since these are the surveys that we've been most involved in, are the most familiar with at the bank. So the World Bank high frequency phone surveys have taken place in more than 100 countries, and in some cases even on a monthly basis. And so they're all subsamples of previously nationally representative surveys or random digit dialing. And they really have been a key source of information on the impact of COVID-19, but much of the work has been at the household level, and so we'll explore what it will take to better engender these and other national or subnational survey efforts. And then finally, I just want to make a note of other survey efforts that have fed into some of the ideas that we present throughout today's session. And so that's the UN Women's Rapid Gender Assessment Tool, as well as the ID Insights Data on Demand team, so the surveys that have been coming out of their work. And then finally, and also the Innovations for Poverty Action Recover surveys, the Young Lives at Work, and then also, during the discussion, we would love to hear about some of the Mix Plus efforts. So when considering phone surveys and gender, there are four particular challenges faced, and these typically fall under four categories. So related to respondent selection, and so making sure we're asking the right questions to the right people. Also the length of the survey, so fitting important gender-related topics into an already quite crowded survey space, when the recommended time limit for phone surveys is about 20 minutes, as well as covering some of the most critical and pressing topics related to women and girls. And then also thinking through special requirements that should be taken into consideration when implementing phone surveys towards better data on women. So based on these challenges, so today we'll provide an overview of approaches to phone survey sampling and respondent selection. So how can we select respondents to help facilitate collection on adult population data for individual level outcomes? So this includes, labor, health, education. Also looking at questionnaire design, so considering questionnaire adaptations to capture information that is pertinent to transformative policies for gender equality in response to the pandemic. And then finally, fieldwork considerations, so considering the approach and sensitivities related to the interview process when it comes specifically to trying to interview and get data more from women and girls. So I'll get us started with the phone survey sampling and then turn it over to Daniel for discussion of respondent selection. But to get us started, so whatever the mode, all phone surveys really need to start with a list of phone numbers to contact. And so there are three common types. And so the first is based on a recent face-to-face survey. So using phone numbers from previous surveys that have been fielded and collected phone numbers. Using a registry of phone numbers, so from the government or mobile phone networks, and then random digit dialing. But all of these three types do come with selection bias. So at the household level, access to mobile phones is a key determinant in whether a population of interest could be interviewed in a phone survey. And so we do, of course, see that mobile phone ownership continues to grow globally and even in low-income countries, but significant segments of the population do still remain uncovered and therefore unrepresented in phone surveys. So the concern here is that this may lead to coverage bias and undermine the representativeness of the phone survey sample, since the population with access to mobile phones can differ meaningfully from that without access. A further concern is unit non-response. So it's possible that even if there is a phone number for a household, a respondent still can't be interviewed. They may refuse the phone call or the interview, and also just an issue with disconnected phone numbers. So these two issues, differential rates of phone ownership as well as survey response, are common to all of the different types of phone surveys, so regardless of sampling frame. But to some extent, they can be addressed by reweighting adjusted for phone ownership and response rates biases. So I'll quickly share some of the work from our colleagues that work in the World Bank Living Standards Measurement Study team and who assess the efficacy of weight adjustment techniques used in the LSMS-supported phone surveys that relied on recent face-to-face surveys as their sampling frame. So first, they looked at the differences between sample groups, so looking at households in the broader baseline surveys versus households that were part of the high-frequency phone surveys, so that those that had phone numbers and that were able to be contacted. And they found that households in the phone survey were wealthier. So when we look at wealth, considering both consumption and assets, as well as the household heads were better educated, and these were typically more urban households. So then they looked at comparisons across the group of households, across a series of outcome variables. So on the right-hand side here, we can see a quick snapshot of some of their analysis. So we can see that the phone survey sample adjusted with weights calibrated for potential selection and non-response bias, and so that estimate is in green, it does bring us closer to the true baseline population in blue. And this holds true across many of the variables that they considered. And so the main takeaway from their work is that overall weight recalibration is relatively successful at reducing bias at the household level. We do have similar selection bias at the individual level. So in this case, we have to consider that in many lower income contexts, fewer women own phones than men. And depending on the context, men or women may have lower likelihood to be responsive to unsolicited survey calls. In some contexts, it may be inappropriate for women to pick up calls from strangers, especially those of the opposite sex. And in other contexts, men are more likely to be employed in the formal sector, so they might have more rigid hours during the day and may be less likely to be captured in phone surveys. Beyond the issue of phone ownership, there are other challenges. So survey design includes choosing the respondent or who within the household answers the questions and to whom the individual level questions are referring. So whether the information is self-reported or reported by a proxy respondent. So household surveys often select a single respondent, and so this is typically described as the most knowledgeable adult in the household, which then often ends up being the household head, or in some cases, the spouse. And so they're asked to report on household level as well as individual level information for other household members. So reporting about the health, labor, and educational outcomes, not only for themselves, but also for other household members. And so this is a concern when we look at the scenario with face-to-face surveys feeding into a phone survey, since often in face-to-face surveys, they've only collected phone numbers for the household heads. And so as you can see on the right here, so this is across the 4 LSMS the 4 LSMS supported phone surveys that we were referring to when talking about household level bias. So you can see here that an underwhelming share of female respondents are female respondents, and an overwhelming share are household heads. And so assessing gendered impacts with mainly household heads as respondents comes with its own challenges. So as we can see here on the right-hand side, in Nigeria, where the majority of the respondents were household heads, they are more likely to be working individuals than other household members. And some of the rapid assessments may understate the extent of COVID impacts in the population. So many survey efforts have attempted to consider gender in their analysis simply by comparing male and female headed households, but this simply doesn't do women and girls justice. So among other issues, female headed households have different characteristics. So a higher dependency ratio because they don't have the male spouse present, and reweighting adjustment that we discussed earlier based on the household weights just doesn't fix this. So then another set of colleagues from the Living Standards Measurement Study team at the World Bank, they implemented individual weighting adjustments. So drawing on the same techniques that we talked about earlier at the household level. And before implementing the individual level weights, they looked at the profiles of phone survey respondents and confirmed that they are definitely not representative of the general adult population. So of course, a more detailed set of the results can be found in the paper referenced here by Brubaker et al. But the major takeaway is that although the individual level weights generally improved the representativeness of the individual level estimates from the phone survey, they did fall short of overcoming selection bias. So the overrepresentation of household heads and mobile phone owners among phone survey respondents just cannot be corrected by the phone survey household weights, which are represented in the graph here as W1. And estimates based on the phone survey individual weights do move us closer to the general adult population for most individual level outcomes, and at least address the bias that we face. But they don't eliminate the difference between the baseline adults. So we do consider that the most effective way to improve the representativeness of individual level estimates may be through survey design. So considering the possibility of randomly selecting one or more respondents. And so I'll now turn it over to Daniel to take us through some of the ideas that we have around respondent selection and how we can better capture information from other individuals in the household. So Daniel, if you just want to let me know each time to switch the slide.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. So picking up from Heather's explanation, it's clear that respondent selection matters as it influences our ability to assess gender impacts. So here we outline several alternatives to engender phone surveys and ensure representativeness of phone surveys at the individual level. So the best ideal scenario here is to collect a full household roster, phone numbers of all household members, and to interview all household members. But having collected a full household roster and all phone numbers, even if we can't interview all household members in the follow-up phone surveys, we can still randomly select the household member to contact and interview them in the follow-up phone surveys. And it's also important to recognize that even with this best intention, not all household members will have a phone. This is a very common scenario in many low-income country settings. But if we have the full household roster, then one option is to ask the phone owner to pass on the phone to a randomly selected household member. Next slide, please. So one potential challenge with this approach is when the randomly selected household member is not available or in proximity to the phone owner, or generally that interviewing more than one respondent is just not feasible. In such case, we may want to consider collecting proxy reporting, which asks the respondent to report on other household members. This is the second best alternative because while proxy reporting may be suitable for easily observable outcomes like work participation, it may not work so well for less visible outcomes like time use. And if we go with a proxy reporting approach, still ideally we want to collect proxy reporting from all household members. But if that's not possible for budgetary reasons or time constraint, for example, then we may want to consider randomly selecting the household member to collect proxy reporting from. So another approach, next slide, please, that eventually was implemented in Indonesia's high-frequency phone survey is adding new respondents. And just to give a little background on Indonesia's experience, Indonesia collected multiple rounds of surveys almost quarterly from May 2020 up till now, with the sixth round being recently completed. The sampling frame comes from a combination of several recent face-to-face surveys to ensure a good coverage from urban and rural population. And the primary objective of this survey initially was to capture household outcomes and socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on a broad range of household outcomes, from employment to food security and social assistance coverage. But for the employment module, given the time and space constraint in the phone survey, they're primarily interested in the loss of employment among primary breadwinners. So this is slightly worse than just the most knowledgeable adult member in the household. Breadwinners are self-identified by the household respondent and is defined as the person who is considered to contribute to the most to household income. And by definition, the breadwinner had to be employed in the pre-period of February 2020. And I'll show you a graph in the next two slides illustrating this. But an implication of this, as Heather also pointed out earlier, is that primary breadwinners are predominantly male and household heads. The graph on the right here shows this point very clearly. The blue bars show the share of female and household heads in the sample of breadwinners. And the yellow bars show the gold standard comparator of Indonesia's National Representative Labor Force Survey in 2020, conducted face-to-face with around 700,000 observations. In comparison, the phone survey covers only 3,400 households. Next slide, please. So going into the fifth round of data collection, the team was interested in looking at the gendered impacts of COVID on employment. So early on, they had done some comparison of male versus female breadwinners' employment outcomes. But as Heather pointed out earlier, household health experience may not reflect well the individual experiences of males and females in the population. So the approach that we take here is to collect an auxiliary sample of randomly selected adult household members in addition to the breadwinners. So given the sampling frame was based on earlier surveys with full household roster, we could randomly select an adult household member of this for this auxiliary sample. So importantly, the randomization will include the breadwinner to ensure that the auxiliary sample will have the same chance of picking different types of individuals in the population. And this will lead to two different scenarios. In the first, where the breadwinner is randomly selected for the auxiliary sample, then only one person is interviewed. We'll use the breadwinner's responses for the auxiliary sample as well. In the second scenario, where another adult household member is the one randomly selected, then we interview two respondents. And what we find is that this approach does well in matching the age and household health distribution in the population. So the graph on the right is very similar to the one earlier, with an additional bar showing the results for the auxiliary sample. Next slide, please. So here I want to focus first on the graph on the left. This is showing work participation of males and females in the pre-pandemic period of February 2020. The light blue bars are showing the original sample of breadwinners compared to the yellow bars of labor force surveys and the teal bars of auxiliary sample. And as I mentioned earlier, the definition of breadwinners had to be employed in the pre-period. So we start off from a 100% work participation in the sample. And right off the bat, this does not compare well to the work participation rates in the labor force survey, where only around 80% of males and 55% of females work. Whereas the auxiliary sample, on the other hand, does relatively well, getting much closer to the true average in the population, despite much smaller sample size. There are several explanations to the slight discrepancy between the labor force survey and the auxiliary sample. For one, we are asking slightly different worded questions to define work participation compared to the LFS, and that's partly the reason. Turning to the graph on the right, which shows work participation in the post-pandemic period in the mid-2020, this shows a very different contrast when we want to infer the impacts of COVID on employment by gender. When we look at the original breadwinner sample, so the light blue bars, it seems like women are more negatively affected. But when we turn to the auxiliary sample, it's actually, or the labor force survey for that matter, it's actually the reverse. The drop in percentage points in work participation is actually larger for males. Okay, so next slide. Slightly switching gear, aside from the importance of respondent selection, given the space and time constraint of phone surveys, Heather initially earlier suggested that the ideal duration goes from for around 20 minutes or so. There's a trade-off on which topics to cover in the phone surveys. So the World Bank's standard high-frequency phone surveys cover various modules on basic household information, knowledge on COVID, behavior changes, and others. And there are competing priorities, which vary across different contexts and country priorities. So countries have some flexibility to play around with the modules. So given that phone surveys should last between 15 to 20 minutes, it's common for countries to rotate the modules to be covered in different rounds. So the first one may cover household information, income loss, and employment. And then in the second round, they'll drop those to make space for questions on food security, coping, and concerns. But in addition to these core modules, it may be useful to consider the country context and where pre-existing gender gaps may lead to further disadvantages, and incorporate additional thematic areas where gender gaps between men and women will likely emerge. For example, time used. So early hypotheses suggested that with school closures and other mobility restrictions, the pandemic would exacerbate care responsibility, which tends to fall more on women than men. And many surveys have confirmed this prediction. Another topic that may be worth considering is the pre-existing access to technology, pre-existing gender gaps in access to technology, including the in favor of men, may be perpetuated during the pandemic. Gender norms may affect intra-household allocation of time and ICT resources allocated during home-based work or learning, prioritizing computers or phone used by males over females. On financial inclusion, men and women's ability to financially cope with the crisis may depend on their access to financial information and their ability to procure financial assistance and or loans. Mobility, so the mobility restrictions may in some contexts be more severe for women and girls. These restrictions may impact their ability to pursue their livelihoods or seek healthcare. On decision making, in many countries, men generally have more decision making power in households, and this may have an impact on women's responses to the pandemic. So the other question is on integrating sensitive topics such as gender-based violence, which, while is important, may require extra caution. And I'll speak more to our experience in integrating a GBV module early on during the pandemic. So we have an ongoing evaluation among migrant communities in rural Indonesia, where we had collected rich baseline data in 2018, where we also collected multiple phone numbers of various household members. So the first principle here is always safety first. So the approach that had been suggested was to not collect violence against women or girls data for the sole purpose of understanding if violence against women increased during COVID-19. But given the context, as these migrant communities are likely vulnerable to income loss due to border closures or lockdowns, and the fact that we had collected rich baseline data, which would allow us to link experiences of violence to impacts on female labor force participation and or to inform policy and programmatic responses, this became a worthwhile undertaking. So we explored innovative ways to gauge the risk of violence without compromising people's safety over the phone. And this was primarily done with how we ask our questions. But we also include several precautionary measures. So first, the violence against women module is almost at the end of the survey. So it will allow enumerators to gauge how busy the respondent is. We also ask whether there's anyone else in the room above the age of 2, and we skip the whole module if the answer is yes. We also tell the respondents a catchphrase to skip questions if or when someone enters the room. So after consulting gender-based violence experts, we developed a series of proxy questions that try to indirectly get at people's feeling of safety at home and or in community, frequency of conflict or arguments at home, and experiences of injury, without attributing it to the cause or the perpetrator. We also use vignette questions, which are hypothetical stories relatable to people in this context. For example, we tell the story of a married couple whose business is experiencing some financial difficulties. The husband is coming home from work, stressed and taking out on the wife. We then ask respondents on how common the situation is in their community and whether COVID had made it worse. Okay, so this brings me to some emerging evidence. First, on this gender-based violence in Indonesia. So first, we find that COVID does increase perceived risk of violence among migrant communities in rural Indonesia. And this is true across the board with all of our indicators. Second, this is where we use machine learning algorithm to identify factors that mitigate or exacerbate likelihood of violence. And two policy messages come very clearly from our analysis. First is that women in food insecure households are more likely to report higher perceived risk of violence. It highlights the critical need to expand and continue the provision of social protection measures during the pandemic. And that second, women having a job is among the strongest protective factors from increased violence due to COVID, which likely is due to increased bargaining power within the household. And this speaks to the broad women's economic empowerment agenda. Aside from the many other benefits that come from increasing female labor force participation, we can add to this list the likelihood of reducing risk of violence. Moving on from gender-based violence to jobs, there have been several studies looking at the effects of COVID on employment. For one, in Vietnam, we find that there's slightly more women who stop work. And among those who stop work, women are more likely to earn less. So among wage workers, women are less likely to receive full salary payment. And those in family business, women are generating lower turnovers than men. So exploring the pathways further in the next slide, we find, as suggested earlier, childcare and occupational segregation being one of the two pathways underpinning these gender differences. Impacts of COVID-19 are likely larger for women because women are more likely to stop work or reduce work to take care of children during the lockdown. And women are also more likely than men to be engaged in service sector, which is going to be more sensitively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. A recent working paper, which harmonizes the high-frequency phone survey from over 40 countries, find that larger shares of women, young workers, and less educated and urban workers are more likely to stop work, and gender differences being particularly pronounced, as we can see here on the graph on the left. Gender gaps in work stoppage stem mainly from differences within sectors, rather than differential employment patterns across sectors. Next slide, please. This paper also looks at how respondent selection matters, and they can do this because in some of the LSMS-supported countries, they actually collect information from all adult members and not just one. And in this context, which is slightly different from the Indonesian case I showed earlier, the paper suggests that gender biases from only interviewing one person per household in high-frequency phone survey does not lead to as pronounced gender differences. Phone surveys give a generally accurate picture of group disparities by gender and employment rates following the onset of the crisis, but not disparities by age. And ex-post reweighting exercise does not much improve in getting to the accurate picture. One final evidence that I want to talk about in the next slide is impacts on adolescents. So earlier hypothesis, and also drawing on experiences from the Ebola crisis, suggests that girls or boys may be impacted by COVID pandemic in different ways, where boys may be dropping out of school to help with household labor. Girls may drop out of school to get married off early. However, speaking from the World Bank side, in the high-frequency surveys, only few countries actually collect sex-segregated information on learning challenges. One evidence comes from an ongoing impact evaluation conducted by South Asia Gender Innovation Lab in Bangladesh. In their follow-up phone survey, they find that about 30% of households report cutting back food to adolescents in the household, compared to about 13% at baseline, with girls having slightly higher likelihood of cutbacks on food. But boys are slightly more likely to report that they are less likely to get protein than girls. Boys and girls are spending, about 50% of boys and girls are spending less time on education than before the lockdown. There's a really high increase on time on household chores or childcare without significant differences between boys and girls. But this is likely due to the fact that girls were already spending twice as much time on chores than boys before the lockdown. And one other interesting finding is that boys are more likely to report lower likelihood of returning to school than girls, which suggests that additional challenges in targeting boys may be relevant in this particular context. And with that, I'll hand it back to Heather to discuss implementation considerations.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So I'll close out the presentation by talking through some of the important implementation considerations when we focus on getting better data on women. So it really needs to be considered across all stages of the fieldwork process. So from pre-survey planning with hiring considerations, all the way through to sensitivity training for enumerators, carefully designed questionnaire content, and then finally ensuring a safe and comfortable interview setting for respondents. So female enumerators should definitely be considered if there are sensitive questions related to violence or that can threaten the safety of women. But even other potentially sensitive questions as well may increase response rates if women feel more comfortable speaking with female enumerators. So as we can see on the right here, through some work that ID Insight did in India, interviewing respondents on the health and economic impacts of COVID, they found that female enumerators were able to complete interviews with female respondents at a higher rate than male enumerators. And so this is, of course, on a smaller sample, but it's something that, we should consider exploring as more surveys go to the field and try to better capture data from women. When it comes to the training of enumerators, there should be, and Daniel, highlighted this as well when he was talking about the GBV work, but during the training of enumerators, there should be sensitivity training adapted to the content of the questionnaire. So trainers should ensure that enumerators do not express judgment regarding questionnaire content, and the responses that they may elicit during the interviews. And so, an obvious one is women experiencing violence, but also just opinions regarding women owning assets. So making sure they don't, express any of their own potential beliefs about whether or not women should have the right to own land or financial accounts. And then also enumerators should be specifically trained to assess participant comfort over the phone. So of course, in face-to-face surveys, it's much easier to read body language cues, but you don't have that same benefit in phone surveys. So the training is really essential before going to the field. When it comes to questionnaire design, and Daniel touched on this as well, but including questions that allow the enumerator to establish if the female respondent can speak in private, and so this should be part of the informed consent, but also just placing the more easy, straightforward questions up front before diving into the more sensitive topics. So giving a chance to build some rapport with the respondent, before getting into these more sensitive topics. And then also just avoiding questions that need a lot of follow-up or explanations. So just considering yes or no questions when possible so that respondents don't need to elaborate too much on their end of the phone call. When we consider a fieldwork protocol, enumerators of course need to remember that they can't control the environment of the respondent in a phone survey. So the respondent can be overheard, answering questions may make them upset, and so there's a lot less control than they would have in a face-to-face survey. So of course, establishing rapport with the respondent before delving into sensitive questions is critical. And if the safety of the respondent can't be guaranteed, then they should consider rescheduling the interview or at least skipping through sensitive content, so related to gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. Some early results coming out of rural India in a study conducted by IFPRI over on the right-hand side here showed that 65% of women had their phone on speaker for at least some of the interview, and this was often at the request of their spouses or in-laws. But some promising evidence coming out of the UN Violence Against Women surveys, so the rapid assessment surveys, they looked at use of the speakerphone, which only ended up at 1%. Only 1% of the sample used the safe word that they provided, and only 3% reported that they were not alone during the interview process. So, this is definitely something to keep in mind and something that surveys going to the field should try to collect data on to better understand the setting that the respondent is in while reporting on the questions. And so finally, I'll finish up. So ID Insight also did some interesting work investigating warm-up questions to try to get past gatekeepers. So gatekeepers being the person that answers the phone that may not be the intended respondent. So if they're trying to pass along the phone to someone else. So they analyzed data from phone surveys in which they recorded how the head of the household responded to the request to pass the phone to a household member of the opposite gender. And on the left-hand side, you can see that they found men refused to pass the phone to women 11 percentage points higher than women refusing to pass the phone to men. So because of that, in one multi-round survey, they observed whether or not warm-up questions or just questions to help put the respondent more at ease, like trying to simulate, the face-to-face survey setting where they might end up speaking to the household head first and building some sort of rapport. They looked at how these warm-up questions, if they helped to increase their ability to speak to female household members. So in round one, they immediately asked a male respondent to pass the phone to a female respondent. And in round two, they asked them like 4 to 6 questions before they asked them to pass the phone. And so they saw how the behavior changed over time. And in round two, when they were asked the warm-up questions, the refusal rate was 4.3 percentage points lower, and the pass rate was 4.1 percentage points higher. And so this, of course, is work done on a much smaller scale, but it kind of leads us nicely into our concluding slide and looking to the future with some ideas for further things that we should investigate. So I'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So when we reflect on the last almost 2 years of COVID response surveys, we can see that the increase in phone surveys has really been useful for monitoring the impact of the pandemic. And looking forward, it'll be a useful tool to complement face-to-face surveys as they're back up and running. Since it really does seem that phone surveys are here to stay, we do need to consider, though, that much of the analysis has focused on household level outcomes, and much of the available gender analysis has focused primarily just comparing male-headed households to female-headed households. Despite that, though, there have been so many lessons learned about phone surveys over the last couple of years, as well as some of the smaller scale phone survey efforts focusing on women. So looking forward, phone survey efforts need to place more attention on survey design to allow for individual analysis. There's a high demand for individual level statistics. One that we have been experiencing at the office is, people are really curious about the impact on education. So wanting to explore, the boys versus girls and their return to school. Because of this, respondent selection strategies should be further integrated into all of the great new survey the new phone survey guidance tools and protocols that have been developed. It's oftentimes a footnote or something that's a bit more of an afterthought, so it should really be, a larger part of guidance provided to survey practitioners. And so, of course, in leading into that, especially in the case of where we're, sampling off of previous face-to-face surveys, further emphasis should also be focused on collecting phone numbers from multiple household members. So I'll leave it at that for now. I think we've finished at about 40 minutes. So I'll leave it at that and looking forward to discussion. We're really excited to hear, any questions or reactions you have, and also about additional work that you may have been working on. One of the references that we shared as part of the presentation was a tip sheet that, Daniel had led the effort on last January, but we've contributed to, and we're hoping to update that in the coming month. And so, it would be great to hear about other work that is done. And I will just note, since the presentation will be shared with you, we have a few slides here at the end linking to different resources and references that we've highlighted throughout the presentation and also in the tip sheet. So I'll wrap up there, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Heather and Daniel. This has been really good, very comprehensive. I had mentioned that we had webinars before on phone surveys, but I don't think we covered these several different aspects of both implementation, design, individual level versus household level information. You actually took the topic from various dimensions, which has been very comprehensive. Thank you so much for that. There was only a couple of comments and questions in the chat box. One more just came in. The first one was on adolescents, limitations and potential fixes in terms of phone surveys with adolescents. There was one slide that you had on adolescents. Maybe you can say a few more things about that. What are the potential challenges and potential fixes on that one? And there was a second question on the design of vignettes, which Daniel, you provided a very useful link reference to that one. I'm sure colleagues will be interested to go to that link and have a look at that on how to design vignettes and how to train on them, etc. So that's going to be really useful. There's one more comment that just came in. What gender-related issues did you face in developing the sampling frame? Which considerations, actions did you put in place to ensure female representativity in the sample? Is a comment, a question which just came in. Let me throw in something else on that one, something in relation to individual level versus household level. You refer to various phone surveys, including MixPlus and several others. Of course, the way that you have tackled the issue of phone surveys has been really in terms of lumping together all kinds of surveys which use phones to interview people rather than the sampling method and the sampling frame and the sampling unit. Whereas we know, of course, some of the World Bank surveys are actually household surveys based on household sample frames, which are then administered on the phone, and some of them are RDDs, for instance. So there's a lot of difference, in my view, in terms of the methodologies, in terms of possibilities in reaching out to individuals. One question from my side, and some of these questions that I have here have come from other colleagues who knew that they wouldn't be able to make it to the webinar today, is what about response rates when it comes to interviewing on a phone survey any household member, for instance, on the phone, versus targeting a specific individual during the phone survey? What happens with the response rates, and how is that likely to affect the reliability of the results, and how much weight manipulation that you would need to do at the end? And another question in terms of consent and ethics. One of the limitations that we have faced in Mix Plus has been that yes, it is ideal to collect phone numbers for all household members, so that you open up various possibilities in terms of randomly selecting one individual, or interviewing all individuals of interest, etc. However, one limitation that we have been introduced by colleagues working on ethics has been that we cannot really ask for phone numbers of individuals from proxy respondents. So if we are doing a household survey, for instance, and if we are interviewing one person, that person cannot actually consent on behalf of somebody else and give somebody else's phone number to us for further follow-up. How would you tackle the problem, that ethical problem in surveys? Sorry, I took a few more minutes than I thought I would.
So I guess I'll take the first question on adolescents, and then I'll leave the difficult questions to Heather. So on adolescents, challenges in reaching adolescents, I think one big one is going to be phone ownership. Depending on the context, it will vary whether the likelihood of adolescents owning a phone. And so one potential fix is to give adolescents with phones before interviewing. And that was one thing that was considered for the impact evaluation earlier, but then given the context, with high shares of phone ownership there was no need to give out phones to reach out to people. But it comes with, this potential fix comes with like potential ethical and safety concerns as well, given that there could be potential different effects and adverse effects of giving out phones to adults. And so I think that could be a challenge depending on the context, and it's not clear whether that fix could actually work without like a proper background or long-term project in place, such as an impact evaluation. So I also put a couple more notes on the other experiences by UN Women on collecting GBV data and the Vignette questions that they use, and also I think they also use list randomization questions, and they have they have a link to that. So I'll head to other difficult questions to you.
Sure. Okay, so I'll get a little bit more then into Attila's comments and questions, looking at different types of sampling methods and response rates. So yeah, I mean, our presentation, we focused more exclusively on phone surveys where we're referring to a previous face-to-face survey. And we did this, well, first of all, the LSMS supported surveys, they really provide a wealth of information to use from the face-to-face survey to then feed into the weight recalibration. So I think that provided a really great opportunity to see, how close can we get to the population estimates, both at the household level as well as the individual level. And so, I think it provides a much more promising fix than some of the other types of phone surveys, where already we expect to have a higher response rate, looking at previous face-to-face surveys than perhaps random digit dialing surveys. And I just pulled up a couple statistics here, so I'll just share them quickly. So for the LSMS supported phone surveys, they successfully contacted between 62 and 94% of the phone numbers that they had from the previous face-to-face. By contrast, a random digit dialing survey that had been conducted in Ghana successfully reached only 15% of phone numbers. So that's kind of been feeding into the analysis in our work. I will also note, so yeah, I mean, this last question on consent and ethics and asking for phone numbers of other respondents, that's a really interesting one, and one that I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer to. Actually, in the LSMS style phone survey or face-to-face surveys that are conducted, we are able to collect phone numbers from other members of the household, and also typically collect phone numbers from 3 reference individuals outside of the household as well. So I think some of this work has had a little bit more flexibility with collecting multiple household members. And so actually feeding into some of the analysis also was one of the LSMS ESA countries of interest was Malawi, where in previous rounds they had not only been collecting information from the household head, but trying for different respondents as well. So that had fed into some early analysis as well, looking at, is it possible to randomize which phone is targeted first when we're making phone calls to households. But actually in the case of Malawi, it still is so heavily balanced towards household heads having the phone numbers. We didn't see much of a difference there because most of the phone numbers, are still linked to the household head. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. I guess actually I do see one other question that popped up in the chat. I don't know, Attila, do you want me to jump into it from Jose?
Yeah, please do so.
Okay. Yeah, I'll share just because I happen to have one other slide available from another presentation. I'll just quickly share because this is kind of looking at response rates over time and considering now that we're going on 2 years from the start of the pandemic. So let me quickly share this slide that captures some of the response rates, at least in the countries that we've been referring to in some of the analysis here. So we can see that actually, so this is looking at the same countries that we provided some of the weights work for. And you can see here, so for Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Malawi, Nigeria, and Uganda, these are phone surveys that they started between April 2020 and June 2020. In all of these cases, they were conducted monthly. And what we can actually see here is that response rates did remain relatively high over time. So I mean, it does seem that there can be an impact, if you've really built a strong relationship with these respondents and you have built good rapport and making clear the importance of collecting this type of data, it does seem possible to maintain these high response rates over time. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Heather.
So one thing that I want to add, lengths and modules. So initially, early on, like from our experience, my experience in conducting of phone surveys. So initially, when we thought about like phone surveys, the ideal recommendation was around 20 minutes or so. But then in the impact evaluation work in Indonesia on migration, for example, that survey, we actually took 40 to 50 minutes, covering a broad range of different modules, and having additional modules didn't really drop the response rates. So, and then I think a similar experience in the high frequency phone survey in Indonesia suggested that we could push to 30-40 minutes without actually increasing the attrition rates by too much. So that's another consideration to add.
Thanks, Daniel and Heather. A couple of more points. One is refreshing samples. You have a number of surveys now which have been going on, phone surveys, longitudinal phone surveys, which have been going on for a year or more. That started last year. And after a while, of course, not only because of response rates, but because of other reasons, the samples that you are using started to, you have higher attrition rates that increase over time. and also the representativity of the samples become problematic over a long period. Have you been using a standard approach in the World Bank surveys to refresh the samples? And if so, what kind of strategy? And then something maybe a little bit political. The future. Let's fantasize that tomorrow the COVID pandemic is going to be over, and next month you are, as World Bank, you are designing data collection exercises. What is the position of World Bank now? Is it to carry on doing phone surveys, or just go back to the normal that we had before pandemic came in, which was that most of the effort and investment would go into face-to-face surveys? What is the position now? What does the World Bank intend to do in the future, when the pandemic is over?
Okay, so maybe I'll jump into the second question first. So looking to the future. So I think that already, phone surveys were something that the World Bank was really starting to consider and really starting to understand the importance of. And so there had been different efforts, even beyond those that we had kind of listed earlier, with the response to the Ebola crisis and food insecurity, but also these listening to Africa surveys. There have also been some listening to LAC surveys, as well as I know one listening to Tajikistan. So these, phone surveys were starting to expand more broadly, conducted by the poverty group at the World Bank. Even beyond that, in the LSMS team, for example, with some of the methodological work, we were also experimenting with, how can we start to take advantage of phone surveys when we think about, collecting better data when it comes to agricultural production. So if we're able to, follow up with households over a period of time, so you have your first baseline survey and then keep in touch with them over a year or some lengthier duration, it gives a possibility to follow up and ask these questions at a more frequent basis. So, I guess my reaction to that question is that it's definitely going, especially now that there are all these new guidance materials, NSOs and different survey implementers, have really now taken the time to consider, what are the best ways to implement phone surveys. I really do think that it is something that will be much more broadly used in the future. Of course, not used as a substitute to our standard face-to-face surveys, which allow for, such greater nuanced information to be collected, but how can it come in as a complement? And then I guess I'll just quickly note, and maybe Daniel knows of other survey efforts, but in terms of refreshing the samples, I actually am not sure of any of the phone surveys at the bank that are currently considering refreshing the sample, or what approach they have used. Though I would assume it's something on the minds, especially of the countries that have had more frequent follow-up with the households. But Daniel, you may be more familiar with some efforts that may have refreshed samples.
Yeah, I haven't had any experiences with any countries that also try to refresh sample. So from the experience of Indonesia, I think they've collected 6 rounds of data collection so far, and generally the attrition rates have not, similar to what Heather showed earlier with the LSMS supported countries, the attrition rates have not really gone up necessarily by much over time, and by around the 6th survey, we still maintain around 3,000 households. And so it's, there has not been a, so it's mostly done by reweighting, not by refreshing the sample.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much. Archana, you want to come in? This has been a really great webinar. Thank you so much, guys. Yeah. I think we are at the top of the hour, right? We had 1 hour scheduled. We are about 11 minutes beyond the hour. So, Archana.
Yes, just wanted to also thank Heather and Daniel for coming on today with a very comprehensive and very engaging presentation. Lots for us to think about. So thank you so much. And I just wanted to wish everybody a happy holidays if you're taking some time off, and a happy new year. And we'll get in touch with everybody again for a new set of webinars in the new year. So thank you both, and thank you all for your questions and comments. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.